Imagine standing before a fortress that's been silent for 400 years. The air is cold, the walls are scarred, and every stone feels like it remembers something it shouldn't. Beneath the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains, this castle once belonged to one of the most powerful women in all of Europe, a noble who ruled her land like a queen, untouched by any law. Her name was Countess Elizabeth Báthory, born into immense privilege, destined for greatness, and later, accused of becoming one of history's most terrifying killers. For nearly 3 decades, young girls walked through her castle gates to serve, and almost none of them walked back out. But what if this wasn't just a story about one woman's cruelty? What if it was about a system, a world, that allowed it to happen? In 16th century Hungary, nobles were protected by laws written in their favor. Power meant immunity. Justice was negotiable. And when whispers began to spread about missing girls and screams echoing from the Countess's fortress, the same laws meant to protect the innocent instead shielded the guilty. Was Elizabeth Báthory truly the Blood Countess, bathing in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth, or was she the victim of a political conspiracy designed to destroy a woman who was simply too wealthy, too educated, and too independent for her time? This isn't just another dark legend. It's a mirror held up to history, and maybe, to power itself. Let's step inside the castle and uncover how law, privilege, and silence created one of the darkest stories Europe has ever known. The story of Countess Elizabeth Báthory doesn't begin with blood or terror. It begins with a broken kingdom, a land where violence was ordinary, where law bent to privilege, and where a person's worth was written in their bloodline. It's the late 1500s, deep in the heart of Central Europe. Hungary stands wounded, carved apart by empires. To the south, the Ottoman Turks push ever northward, claiming villages and cities with fire and iron. To the west, the Habsburg monarchy spreads its reach from Vienna, pulling the remaining Hungarian nobility into its orbit. And in the east, Transylvania clings to its fragile independence, a flicker of native rule caught between 2 giants. This fractured world is where Elizabeth Báthory was born, a child of unimaginable privilege in a time of unimaginable cruelty. The 16th century in Europe was a brutal era, but Hungary was something different. It was chaos wrapped in formality. Feudal law ruled every corner of life. The church loomed large, the crown struggled for control, and in the space between them, nobles became kings of their own territories. Each noble family commanded private armies, minted their own justice, and in many regions, even issued death sentences without consulting any royal court. On paper, there were laws. In practice, there were only hierarchies. The peasants, called serfs, were bound to the land, unable to leave without permission. Their fates, their families, and sometimes their lives belonged to whoever owned the soil beneath their feet. In such a world, power wasn't just political, it was spiritual. To the common folk, nobles were almost godlike. To challenge them wasn't only dangerous, it was unthinkable. When a noble spoke, priests bowed. When a peasant cried, no one listened. And in that silence, monsters could grow. Elizabeth was born in 1560 at the family seat in Nyírbátor, into one of the most powerful dynasties Eastern Europe had ever seen. The Báthory name was legend. They had produced kings, princes, generals, even heroes who fought to defend Christianity against the Turks. Her uncle, Stephen Báthory, ruled as King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. Her cousins commanded armies. Her relatives owned castles that dotted the countryside like chess pieces in a grand game of war and power. For Elizabeth, the world was never uncertain. From the day she was born, she was above it. She grew up surrounded by wealth, education, and authority. But the world around her, the one beneath her feet, was built on fear. Her family's land stretched for miles. Peasants worked from dawn until death. They owed taxes, labor, and loyalty to their masters. For most, hunger was constant, and the only law they knew came from the estate lord's word. To live in such a world was to understand that cruelty was normal, not because people were born evil, but because power made it acceptable. Elizabeth wasn't like most noblewomen of her time. She was educated, remarkably so. She could read and write in Hungarian, Latin, German, and Greek. She studied science, mathematics, and politics. She read philosophy when most women her age were learning embroidery. Her intelligence was praised, but it also set her apart. In a world where a woman's value was measured in marriage alliances and heirs, Elizabeth's mind was both her strength and her threat. From early childhood, she witnessed the raw brutality of war and the rigid codes of noble life. Public executions were common. Torture wasn't taboo, it was justice. Religious wars tore through the region, and violence seeped into daily routine like smoke through old stone. Imagine growing up in a place where mercy was weakness, where every decision had to prove dominance, and where even faith was a battlefield. That was Elizabeth's childhood. That was the foundation that would shape everything she became. It's easy to imagine the Báthory story as an isolated nightmare, one woman's descent into madness. But what truly made her crimes possible was the law itself. Under Hungary's feudal code, nobles enjoyed a concept called high justice, the right to judge, punish, and execute their own subjects. No royal investigator could step foot on a noble estate without permission. In practice, this meant the castles of the powerful were miniature kingdoms, cut off from oversight. What happened within those walls stayed there. The system was designed to maintain order in a decentralized land. But instead, it created a perfect breeding ground for corruption and abuse. A noble could kill a servant and claim it was discipline. A noble could confiscate land, silence witnesses, rewrite church records, and face no consequence. It wasn't just tolerated. It was expected. The entire hierarchy depended on keeping the lower classes quiet, obedient, and afraid. Elizabeth didn't invent cruelty, she inherited it. She merely perfected what her society already allowed. While Elizabeth's family enjoyed luxury and influence, the rest of Hungary was bleeding. The Battle of Mohacs in 1526 had shattered the nation's independence, dividing it into three parts: the Central Plains under Ottoman control, the western lands governed by the Habsburgs, and Transylvania, semi-independent but always under threat. This division didn't just split borders, it split loyalties, families, and faiths. The Protestant Reformation was tearing Europe apart, and Hungary stood right at its fault line. Elizabeth's relatives were divided, some Catholic, others Protestant. These divisions weren't just theological, they were political weapons. Every alliance, every marriage, every favor carried religious undertones. To be born into this world was to inherit both privilege and paranoia. And amid these feuds, the peasantry suffered most. Raids from Turkish forces, famine from ruined harvests, and plague outbreaks left thousands of orphans. For many of those children, the only escape from starvation was service in noble households. It was a cruel irony: the castle offered survival, and sometimes, death. At age 11, Elizabeth was betrothed to Ferenc Nadasdy, heir to another powerful noble family. At 15, she married him. Their union wasn't a romance, it was a political alliance, one that united two vast fortunes and armies. Ferenc was known as the Black Knight of Hungary, famed for his ruthless campaigns against the Turks. While he fought abroad, Elizabeth managed their estates. She ran the finances, resolved disputes, handled correspondence, and ensured taxes were collected. In every sense, she became the lord of the manor. Her skill impressed even her peers. She was efficient, commanding, and unflinching, a perfect noblewoman by the standards of her time. But as years passed, whispers began to spread. Servants spoke of her temper. Local priests noticed an unusually high number of funerals for young maids. Disappearances were quietly explained as runaways or Turkish raids. And in a world without oversight, such explanations were enough. When Ferenc died in 1604, Elizabeth's authority expanded even further. Now a widow, she answered to no husband, no father, no king. Under Hungarian law, her independence was nearly absolute. It was in that void, between unchecked power and unchallenged fear, that something began to rot. By the early 1600s, Elizabeth Báthory controlled one of the largest estates in the kingdom. She commanded hundreds of servants and soldiers. She held debts owed to her by the crown itself. And she ruled from a remote fortress perched high above the countryside, a place called Castle Čachtice. From its towers, you could see for miles. From its gates, no one could see in. It was the perfect setting for both nobility and nightmare. But before the horrors began, before the legends of bloodbaths and the whispered name, the Blood Countess, there was this world, a kingdom cracked by war, sustained by inequality, and ruled by privilege so powerful it could hide any crime. The story of Countess Báthory isn't just about what she did inside those castle walls. It's about the world that let her do it. By the dawn of the 17th century, Countess Elizabeth Báthory was one of the most powerful women in Europe. She ruled vast lands, commanded armies, and managed an empire of estates stretching across northern Hungary and Slovakia. To her peasants, she was more than a noble, she was the law itself. But somewhere behind the stone walls of her castles, that law began to twist. After the death of her husband Ferenc Nadasdy in 1604, Elizabeth's world changed. His passing left a void, not of love, but of restraint. Ferenc, the Black Knight, had been brutal in war, but by most accounts, disciplined at home. Without him, Elizabeth was no longer a partner in power, she was its sole architect. At 34, she was a widow with wealth beyond measure and a reputation for intelligence and control. She supervised every corner of her estates, crops, taxes, disputes, even punishments. Her letters from this period show a woman meticulous and proud, signing each document with an elegant, steady hand. But beneath that signature lay another kind of record, one not written in ink, but in whispers. Servants began to disappear. At first, it was subtle. A young maid ran away, they said. Another fell ill and died suddenly. A third returned to her village in silence and never spoke again. In a world without newspapers, without police, without justice beyond the manor gates, such things passed unnoticed. Or rather, they were noticed, and quietly feared. The fortress at Čachtice was unlike any other. Built high on a limestone ridge, it commanded the surrounding valleys with the arrogance of centuries. Its thick walls were meant to keep enemies out, but in Elizabeth's time, they served a darker purpose, they kept secrets in. Inside, the rhythms of daily life continued, cooks prepared meals, maids scrubbed stone floors, guards patrolled by torchlight. But those who worked closest to the Countess spoke of an atmosphere that grew heavier each year, a sense that something unseen watched from the corridors. New servants were often young peasant girls, some as young as 12 or 13, sent by desperate families to earn wages or favor. They came barefoot, clutching letters of introduction, their mothers praying they'd find mercy in noble service. For a few days, they did. Then they vanished. Their families were told the girls had fled, had stolen something, had joined the soldiers on the road. Most parents dared not question further. To accuse a noble of wrongdoing was to risk one's own life. Fear replaced grief. Silence became survival. Elizabeth did not act alone. Every system of cruelty needs its machinery, its willing hands. Her household staff included a small inner circle of trusted servants, people who owed her everything. Among them were Dorothea Sendis, known as Dorka, an older woman said to be both nurse and accomplice, Ilona Jo, her chambermaid, Janos Ujeri, nicknamed Fixco, a soldier turned bodyguard, and later, a mysterious young woman named Katerina Benex. Each played a role, recruiting, restraining, cleaning, burying. Whether through fear, loyalty, or moral decay, they became extensions of Elizabeth's will. There were rumors, even among other nobles, that the Countess's punishments had grown excessive. A servant who broke a needle while sewing was beaten. A maid who spilled wine was whipped until she could no longer stand. But the whispers went further, of rooms where screams echoed, of nights when torches burned long past midnight. Still, no one intervened. Not because they didn't believe, but because they did. Feudal Hungary's legal system gave nobles near absolute authority within their lands. To challenge one's lord or lady was to challenge the order of the kingdom itself. Even local officials, priests, and lesser nobles avoided interference. A priest named János Panakinas reportedly complained to church authorities after noticing the unusual number of burials from the countess's estate. He was warned to stay silent. Soon after, his church received generous donations, and the matter vanished. Elizabeth understood the system too well. She'd been raised within it, mastered it, and now she weaponized it. Punishment wasn't just retribution, it was theater, a reminder to everyone below her that power was pain, and obedience was survival. In letters to other nobles, she continued to project the image of a responsible widow managing her estate through difficult times. Her handwriting remained calm and elegant, even as death multiplied around her. It's one of history's darkest paradoxes, that a woman so educated, so refined, could cloak unspeakable acts behind the elegance of her rank. Beyond the castle walls, the countryside bled quietly. The Ottoman wars had devastated farmlands. Crops failed, villages burned, famine stalked the valleys. The line between life and death blurred for the poor. For many families, sending a daughter to work for the countess seemed a miracle: food, shelter, wages. They didn't see a predator, they saw salvation. And in a cruel twist of history, it was their very desperation that made them perfect prey. The social gap between noble and peasant was a chasm. A noble's word outweighed a dozen peasants' testimonies. If a girl went missing, the blame was often placed on her: immoral, careless, sinful. The dead could not defend their honor, and the living dared not try. It wasn't merely Elizabeth's cruelty that killed, it was an entire hierarchy that allowed her to feed it. By 1608, the rumors had reached the royal court in Vienna. Reports of missing girls, strange screams from the castle, and the countess's growing cruelty began circulating among the nobility. But even then, action came slowly. Why? Because the crown owed her money. King Matthias II was in debt to the Countess Báthory estate, a debt so massive that prosecuting her could threaten the monarchy's finances. Power protected power, as it always had. And so the disappearances continued. In villages across northern Hungary, parents whispered warnings to their daughters: do not go to the lady's castle. But hunger doesn't listen to warnings. Every time one family refused, another desperate one took their place. What emerged over time wasn't just fear, it was myth. Tales of a countess who drank blood, who bathed in it to stay young, who summoned spirits in her tower, began to circulate among the peasants. These stories were born from trauma, from what people saw but could not explain, from what they knew but dared not name. Somewhere in the fog between truth and legend, Elizabeth Báthory became something more than human, both a symbol and a curse. As the years passed, her behavior grew more reckless. The number of victims, if even a fraction of the testimonies are true, increased sharply after her husband's death. Servants from her secondary estates began reporting that new girls were being brought in from faraway villages, as local families had learned to keep their daughters away. By the end of the decade, even members of the lower nobility began to whisper. One minor noble family, the Szabos, sent their daughter to Čachtice as a companion to the countess. When they heard nothing from her for months, they asked to visit. They were told she had run away with a soldier. Later, a servant confided the truth: she had been beaten to death for accidentally breaking a mirror. That moment marked a shift. For the first time, the victims were no longer faceless peasants. They were daughters of noble blood, and noble blood demanded answers. Even the countess's own servants began to falter. The horror they had participated in started to consume them. One maid fled the castle and sought refuge in a nearby church, trembling as she spoke of the things done in the night. Her account reached the local governor, and from there, eventually, the Palatine of Hungary himself, György Thurzó. By 1609, the web of silence was unraveling. The walls that had once hidden everything began to echo with rumors that could no longer be ignored. Elizabeth Báthory had spent decades untouchable, protected by title, by wealth, by law. But power, even absolute power, has limits. And hers was about to meet them. What began as whispers would soon become one of the most infamous investigations in European history. Before it ended, kingdoms would tremble, alliances would fracture, and the Blood Countess would pass from flesh into legend. But at this point, in the quiet before the storm, no one knew that the woman behind those castle walls was about to face the world she thought she owned. By the winter of 1609, the silence surrounding Countess Elizabeth Báthory had begun to crack. Whispers that once lingered in taverns and village chapels had found their way into the halls of power. What began as rumors of missing servants was now an open secret in noble circles. The most powerful woman in Hungary might also be its darkest monster. For years, the crown ignored it, until politics, debt, and fear aligned to make Elizabeth Báthory's downfall not just inevitable, but useful. King Matthias II, ruler of the fractured Hungarian kingdom, had long been in debt to the Báthory Nadasdy estate. Ferenc Nadasdy, Elizabeth's late husband, had financed major military campaigns against the Turks, and the crown owed the family an enormous fortune. That debt had become a problem, and now, a convenient motive. By late 1609, complaints had reached the royal court in Vienna and the Palatine of Hungary, György Thurzo, one of the kingdom's highest-ranking officials. Thurzo was a shrewd politician, loyal to both the king and his own ambitions. He was also a relative by marriage to the Báthory family. At first, he hesitated. To move against Elizabeth meant risking scandal, family disgrace, and political chaos. But to ignore her meant allowing an open wound to fester in the kingdom's moral order. Then came reports that changed everything. Victims were no longer only peasant girls. Daughters of the minor nobility, girls from families with influence, had begun to disappear as well. These noble parents had voices, and their voices reached Vienna. Thurzo's approach was strategic. Rather than confront the countess directly, he began quietly gathering evidence. He sent trusted officials to the villages surrounding Čachtice and to her other estates. They collected testimonies from priests, peasants, and surviving servants. The stories they heard were consistent, detailed, and horrifying. Witnesses spoke of girls lured with promises of work, only to vanish inside the castle walls. They described nights when screams echoed from the tower, and mornings when carts left the gates carrying what looked like sacks of grain but smelled of death. One priest recounted performing so many hurried burials for Elizabeth's servants that he had stopped asking questions altogether. Another described being bribed with silver to record deaths as illness or accidents. As more testimonies poured in, Thurzo began to see a pattern, a systematic operation hidden beneath noble decorum. Each element of Elizabeth's household played a role: recruiters, guards, torturers, record keepers. It wasn't a crime of passion, it was a structure. Still, all of this remained rumor without physical proof. And in feudal Hungary, rumors were not enough to indict a countess. In December 1610, Thurzo decided to act. Winter had covered the Carpathian foothills in snow, muffling every sound. On the night of December 29, Thurzo and his men rode through the darkness toward Čachtice Castle, their torches flickering in the freezing air. Accounts of what they found vary, colored by politics and time. Some say they entered quietly, catching the countess by surprise. Others say they forced open the gates and stormed inside. But all agree that what they discovered was undeniable. In the great hall, they found a girl, already dead. Another lay dying nearby. In the dungeons below, they found several still alive, chained and bloodied, some barely able to speak. The scene was chaos, terrified servants, abandoned instruments of punishment, and the unmistakable stench of death. Even in an age accustomed to violence, what Thurzo saw that night defied understanding. He ordered the castle sealed. Elizabeth Báthory, the untouchable countess, was placed under guard in her own home. By morning, all of Hungary was whispering her name. Despite the gruesome evidence, Elizabeth herself was never formally put on trial. Her noble status made it politically dangerous to prosecute her directly. The king wanted justice, but not scandal. The Báthory family wanted protection, but not disgrace. And Thurzo, ever the strategist, wanted to serve both interests without losing face. So a compromise was struck. Elizabeth's 4 closest servants, Dorothea Sentis, Ilona Jo, János Ugeri, and Katerina Benex, would stand trial in her place. Their testimonies, obtained under torture, would reveal the horrors of the castle. The trial began in January 1611. Witness after witness stepped forward, priests, peasants, servants. Some claimed to have seen bodies buried near the castle. Others described hearing screams in the night or finding blood-stained clothing. One servant swore she had seen the countess herself strike victims in rage, while another insisted she collected their blood for strange rituals. The testimonies blurred the line between evidence and legend, fact and fear. But what truly shocked the court was a written list, allegedly found among the countess's documents, naming over 650 victims. Its authenticity has never been confirmed, but even a fraction of that number would make her one of history's most prolific killers. The servants were convicted. 2 of the women, Dorothea and Ilona, had their fingers torn out with hot pincers before being burned alive. János, the guard, was beheaded before burning, mercy granted for his youth. Only Katerina, who cooperated fully, was spared execution and sentenced to life imprisonment. As for Elizabeth, she was never called to testify. She remained locked away in her castle, awaiting a judgment that would never come. Instead of public execution, Elizabeth Báthory was placed under permanent house arrest, a decision negotiated by Thurzo and her powerful relatives. Officially, it was to protect her noble dignity. In truth, it was to protect everyone else's. The arrangement was grimly symbolic. She would live out her remaining years surrounded by the same walls that had hidden her crimes. Windows were bricked up, doors sealed, guards posted at every entrance. She was forbidden contact with the outside world. From time to time, servants brought her food and water through a small slot in the wall. Reports suggest she spent her final years writing letters, obsessively cataloguing her innocence, and blaming her servants for betrayal. On the night of August 21, 1614, a guard found her lying still on the floor. She was dead, 54 years old. She was buried quietly, without ceremony, and later her remains were moved to an unknown location, as villagers refused to let her body rest in their churchyard. The woman who once ruled over life and death died alone, surrounded only by silence and stone. Elizabeth's death did not end the story, it transformed it. In the months following, the Báthory family worked tirelessly to erase or rewrite the record. They destroyed documents, bribed witnesses, and spread the idea that the countess had been a victim of political persecution, framed by jealous men who coveted her wealth. The king, meanwhile, quietly cancelled his debt to the Báthory estate. Justice had been done, at least in the eyes of those who benefited from it. But the truth was far messier. Historians today still debate how much of the legend was real. Was she truly a sadistic killer, or a pawn sacrificed to politics? Were the stories of bathing in blood grotesque exaggerations meant to sell pamphlets and justify her downfall? What remains beyond doubt is that young women vanished, bodies were found, and fear ruled her lands for decades. The system that created her, feudal, patriarchal, unaccountable, was as guilty as any individual. Elizabeth Báthory became a symbol, not just of cruelty, but of unchecked power. In the centuries that followed, her legend grew beyond recognition. Writers turned her into a vampire countess, bathing in virgin blood to preserve her youth. Painters imagined her as a Gothic demon. Modern media turned her into myth, the female Dracula. But beneath the fiction lies a far more human horror, a story about privilege without restraint, justice without accountability, and lives deemed expendable because of class and gender. The trial that never happened still echoes across history, a reminder that the line between power and monstrosity is thinner than we like to believe. Elizabeth Báthory's story isn't just a cautionary tale from the past. It's a mirror, reflecting every age that allows power to hide its crimes behind beauty, wealth, and law. The story of Countess Elizabeth Báthory should have ended with her death, locked inside her fortress, buried in secrecy, erased from polite history. But as with all great horrors, death was not an ending. It was a transformation. When she took her final breath in August 1614, the walls of Castle Čachtice were silent. The woman who once commanded armies of servants and instilled terror across her lands now lay cold and still, watched over by guards who had once feared to look her in the eye. Her body was buried hastily within the castle grounds, but even in death, the people could not bear her presence. Within days, angry villagers demanded her remains be removed. According to local legend, the body was secretly reburied in the Báthory family crypt far away, and later, even that grave vanished from history. No one knows where her bones rest today. Some say the earth itself refused her. In the weeks following her death, the Hungarian nobility and the royal court scrambled to contain the scandal. The crown's debt to the Báthory dynasty estate, an enormous sum, was quietly wiped clean. Official records framed the outcome as justice done, the guilty countess confined until death, the victims avenged, and peace restored. But beneath the surface, everyone understood what had really happened. There had been no trial, no confession, no reckoning. The law had served power, not truth. The servants had been executed, the evidence buried, and the noble families had closed ranks to protect their own. Thursow's report to King Matthias II painted Elizabeth as a woman overcome by madness, a convenient explanation that shifted the focus away from the system that had allowed her crimes to flourish. Yet the court could not completely control the narrative. News of the raid, the discoveries, and the testimonies spread like wildfire through Europe. What began as political scandal quickly turned into legend. In an age before journalism, information traveled by rumor, sermon, and pamphlet. The more the authorities tried to bury the story, the more it grew in the telling. Writers across Europe began to describe Elizabeth Báthory not as a noblewoman or criminal, but as something supernatural, a woman who drank and bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. These tales emerged decades after her death, evolving with every retelling. In German, she became Die Blutgräfin, the Blood Countess. In Hungarian folklore, she was whispered as Erzsébet of Veracini, Elizabeth, the woman of blood. The myth was irresistible. It combined the era's fears of female power, religious heresy, and moral decay into one story. In a world where men ruled politics, the church, and the courts, the idea of a woman wielding such absolute, corrupt authority was terrifying, and thrilling. Pamphlets printed in Vienna, Prague, and Krakow described her supposed rituals: young girls chained in dungeons, their blood collected in golden basins, the countess emerging radiant after her baths. Artists painted her surrounded by candles and corpses. Poets compared her to Lilith and Medusa. The historical woman vanished beneath the growing myth. By the 18th century, Elizabeth Báthory had become more than a criminal, she was a cultural archetype. Her legend echoed through Gothic literature, influencing stories like Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla and later, Bram Stoker's Dracula. She was no longer a Hungarian noblewoman. She was the embodiment of evil, immortality, and feminine corruption. While her name spread through Europe's salons and printing houses, the people who had lived under her rule were left with ghosts. The villages around Čachtice never recovered completely. Entire generations of families had lost daughters, sisters, and mothers whose names would never appear in court records. In the decades that followed, those communities carried their trauma through whispered folktales. Parents told their children never to stray too close to the ruins, never to trust nobles who promised work behind castle walls. The peasants spoke of screams that still echoed on cold nights, of flickering lights in the abandoned towers, and of a woman's shadow watching from the ramparts. These stories became part of local identity, a way to make sense of the suffering that no court ever acknowledged. In this sense, Elizabeth's victims lived on, not through justice, but through memory. And yet, even this memory was fragile. For centuries, official Hungarian history avoided the case entirely. The Báthory name remained influential, and acknowledging one of their own as a murderer would have been unthinkable. The archives were sealed, and the legend was left to foreign writers who reshaped it into horror and entertainment. Modern historians have tried to separate myth from truth. What they found is a portrait both clearer and more complex than either side of the old debate. The records of the 1611 trials still exist, hundreds of pages of testimony, much of it taken under torture. Some witnesses described acts of unspeakable cruelty, beatings, mutilations, starvation, freezing, burning. Others offered hearsay, repeating stories they'd only heard from others. Even Thursow's official documents show signs of careful editing, names omitted, numbers inflated or reduced to fit political needs. Was Elizabeth Báthory guilty of murder? Almost certainly. Dozens of bodies and first-hand testimonies confirm systematic violence. But was she guilty of the more fantastical claims, bathing in blood, cannibalism, witchcraft? That remains doubtful. What seems most likely is that Elizabeth was both a product and a victim of her world, a woman born into limitless privilege, hardened by war and feudal cruelty, consumed by the same violence that shaped her society. Her crimes were extraordinary in scale but not in kind. In a kingdom where nobles could kill peasants without consequence, she simply took that power to its logical extreme. By the 19th century, Elizabeth's name had become legend across Europe. Painters, novelists, and playwrights resurrected her image as a symbol of vanity and corruption. Her castle, long abandoned, became a pilgrimage site for the curious. Travelers wrote of standing among its ruins, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. In 1720, a local priest wrote that, "No bird sings above Cactus, and that the soil there will not grow grass where blood was spilled." By the 1800s, tour guides in the region were already selling the tale of the Bloody Countess to visitors. The story entered modern culture with renewed force in the 20th century. Films, novels, and even heavy metal bands revived her legend. Some portrayed her as a demon, others as a misunderstood victim of patriarchal politics. Feminist scholars later revisited her life, arguing that her gender, and her independence, made her an easy target for vilification in a world ruled by men. But even these reinterpretations could not erase the darkness at the heart of the story. Whether she was a monster or a myth, the truth remains the same: hundreds of young women died, and the system that allowed it remained untouched for generations. Today, the ruins of Castle Cactus still stand, a skeletal monument on a lonely hill in Slovakia, its crumbling towers glowing gold at sunset. Tourists climb the narrow path, read plaques about the Blood Countess, and take photos where torture chambers once stood. Beneath the scenic beauty lies an uneasy question: how do we remember horror without glorifying it? Local historians now work to restore a more balanced memory, one that honors the victims rather than the legend. Exhibits and guided tours focus not on blood and superstition, but on the historical context, the corruption of feudal law, the vulnerability of peasants, the unchecked power of nobility. Still, the myth persists. Because myths are easier to face than the truth. Monsters can be defeated, systems cannot. For centuries later, Elizabeth Báthory remains a mirror. To some, she is a vampire. To others, a warning. But beneath every retelling lies the same lesson, that evil is rarely born in isolation. It grows in silence, in fear, and in privilege unchallenged. The story of the Blood Countess is not just about what one woman did inside her castle walls. It is about what her world allowed her to do. And perhaps that is the most terrifying truth of all. 400 years have passed since the death of Countess Elizabeth Báthory, and yet, her name still bleeds through history like a wound that never healed. Her story refuses to die, not because of the blood she shed, but because of what it reveals about power, fear, and the way societies remember their monsters. Today, Elizabeth Báthory stands at the crossroads of myth and history, part noblewoman, part nightmare, and part reflection of the world that created her. Walk among the ruins of Castle Cactus today and you'll feel it, the silence. The wind whispers through the broken archways, the stones carry centuries of secrets, and the valleys below seem to hold their breath. Tourists climbed the steep hill to see the Blood Countess's castle, taking photos where torture once replaced mercy. But for every thrill-seeker who comes chasing legend, there are others who come to understand something deeper, how power can warp morality, and how the line between civilization and cruelty can vanish behind stone walls. Modern historians now view the Báthory case as a mirror reflecting Europe's contradictions, the clash between reason and superstition, patriarchy and power, law and privilege. Elizabeth's story is not just about murder. It's about how an entire system allowed one person to believe she was untouchable, and how that same system later sacrificed her to protect itself. She was both a ruler and a prisoner of her era. Born into privilege, raised in violence, and doomed by the very structure that once empowered her. In the centuries that followed her death, Elizabeth Báthory's story was reshaped again and again, often by men who could not separate horror from fascination. In 1729, a Jesuit historian described her as a demon in woman's flesh. In the 18th and 19th centuries, writers turned her into the ultimate warning against female vanity and independence. At a time when women were expected to obey, Báthory became the archetype of what happens when a woman refuses to. The myth of the blood baths, though likely fabricated, fit neatly into the narrative, a noblewoman so obsessed with beauty and youth that she sacrificed innocence to maintain her power. It wasn't just a horror story. It was a morality play. In this way, her legend served two purposes. To the patriarchal elite, it reinforced the idea that women who wield power will inevitably abuse it. And to the public, it turned violence into spectacle, the sins of the powerful repackaged as entertainment. But what makes her story truly disturbing isn't just what she did. It's how her gender shaped how history remembers her. Male nobles of the same era committed atrocities just as horrific, massacres, rapes, mutilations, yet they were remembered as warriors or tyrants, not monsters. Elizabeth, however, became something else entirely, a witch, a vampire, a symbol of unnatural femininity. It's not to absolve her of guilt, countless lives ended in her shadow. But the transformation of a cruel noble into a supernatural creature reveals as much about society's fear of powerful women as it does about her crimes. The line between fact and fiction in Báthory's story has blurred almost completely. Historians who've revisited the original 1611 trial records find inconsistencies and contradictions. Some testimonies appear coerced, others read like folklore. The number of victims, 650, likely comes from a single unverified document, and no physical list was ever found. But that uncertainty only strengthened her legend. Over time, each generation remade Elizabeth Báthory into what it needed her to be. In the Enlightenment, she became an example of superstition overcome by reason. In the Romantic era, she was recast as a Gothic icon, a fallen beauty cursed by her own sins. In the 20th century, she evolved into the female Dracula, her image twisted into horror films, novels, and even pop culture icons. Each retelling pushed her further from reality and closer to myth, yet the fascination endures. Because behind the exaggerations lies a truth people recognize instinctively: power without conscience is timeless. Modern psychologists have tried to analyze Elizabeth Báthory through a contemporary lens. Some suggest she displayed traits of psychopathy, charm, intelligence, lack of empathy, sadism. Others see a potential mixture of trauma, isolation, and religious delusion, shaped by an upbringing where violence was normalized. As a child, Elizabeth likely witnessed executions, floggings, and battlefield wounds. She lived in a world that equated control with cruelty. And as an adult widow wielding total authority, she operated in an environment where no one could tell her no, yet psychology alone cannot explain her story. What makes it haunting is not the possibility of madness, but the collective complicity that surrounded it. Servants participated. Officials ignored it. Priests stayed silent. A society built on hierarchy made it possible, and then pretended to be shocked when the results emerged. The lesson is not just about one woman's evil, but about how power creates ecosystems of silence. Today, Elizabeth Báthory is more than a historical figure, she's a brand. Her name appears in films, songs, video games, even cosmetics. She has become the Gothic muse of everything from vampire literature to black metal music. But with that fascination comes a question: why are we still drawn to her? Perhaps because she represents something humanity still wrestles with, the allure of forbidden power, the seduction of control. In her, people see a reflection of our darkest desires, to dominate, to manipulate, to defy morality when no one is watching. She is both the monster and the mirror. And that duality ensures her immortality far more than any myth of bathing in blood ever could. For feminists, she has become an uneasy symbol, a woman punished not only for her cruelty but for her autonomy. For moralists, she's the ultimate warning, that privilege breeds rot. For artists and storytellers, she's an eternal muse, forever reinvented. And for historians, she remains an unsolved riddle, a woman trapped between truth and legend, justice and propaganda. The story of Elizabeth Báthory endures because it exposes something universal. Every age has its monsters, and every society decides which ones to fear, and which ones to forgive. Her crimes, if even half true, were monstrous. But so was the world that created her. The peasants who suffered had no voice. The nobles who benefited from her downfall faced no punishment. The king who cancelled his debts under the guise of justice walked away richer. It's tempting to see Báthory as a singular evil, an outlier. But perhaps she was simply the most visible symptom of a deeper sickness, a system that valued status over humanity, law over justice, silence over truth. And that sickness did not die with her. It evolved. Today, we still see echoes of it, in systems that protect the powerful, in hierarchies that silence victims, in cultures that turn cruelty into spectacle. Elizabeth's castle may have crumbled, but the world that allowed her to exist has never truly disappeared. For centuries later, the legend of Elizabeth Báthory endures because it forces us to confront our fascination with evil, especially when it wears a beautiful face. She is remembered not because she was unique, but because she was revealed. For every Báthory that history recorded, there were countless others hidden behind rank, title, and silence. Her story reminds us that power, unchecked and unaccountable, will always find its victims. And that every society, no matter how advanced, risks repeating the same cycle if it forgets where cruelty begins. In the end, the Blood Countess is not only a figure from the past. She is a question that echoes through time: what happens when power believes it will never be punished? And how many more castles still stand, walls high, doors locked, horrors unseen, waiting for someone brave enough to look inside? Centuries fade, but some names refuse to be forgotten. Countess Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess, has escaped the confines of history and risen into myth. What began as whispered tales of cruelty in a remote Hungarian castle has become one of the most enduring legends in Western culture. Her name is now uttered alongside Dracula, her face painted in novels, films, and songs, a symbol not only of horror but of humanity's fascination with darkness. Her story, like blood on stone, could never be washed away. It simply changed shape. The first transformation came long after her death. In the centuries that followed, as memory turned to folklore, the real Elizabeth Báthory, noblewoman, widow, prisoner, was replaced by a supernatural creature of fear. Pamphlets circulated across Europe describing a countess who bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. It was the perfect tale for a society obsessed with morality and terrified of female ambition. By the 18th century, the legend had grown beyond Hungary's borders. Poets and travelers spoke of a castle where screams once echoed through the Carpathian mist, where a woman's vanity became a curse. The Enlightenment may have declared itself the age of reason, but stories of Báthory proved that superstition still had power over the human mind. The image of the Blood Countess began to crystallize: pale skin, crimson lips, a gown stained with centuries of sin. She was not just a historical figure anymore, she was an archetype, an embodiment of seduction, power, and punishment. The 19th century gave her new life. The Romantic movement, fascinated by death, beauty, and the forbidden, rediscovered her story with feverish imagination. Writers like Laszlo Tarazzi and Valentine Penrose transformed her into a Gothic icon. She was now a woman who defied nature itself, who sought immortality through blood. In this era, she became the female counterpart to Dracula. Both were aristocrats feeding on innocence, both lived in castles overlooking the Carpathians, and both represented the corruption of privilege. But while Dracula's evil was male, external, and monstrous, Báthory's was feminine, internal, and psychological, the horror of beauty turned deadly. Painters and poets began depicting her as a tragic figure rather than a mere villain. In their hands, she was both the predator and the victim, consumed by her own obsession with youth, trapped in a world that demanded beauty from women but condemned those who sought to preserve it. This duality, horror and pity, made her myth eternal. The 20th century brought her back to life in moving images. From early silent films to modern horror, Elizabeth Báthory's legend became visual again. Directors in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and later Hollywood used her as a symbol of timeless evil. In 1971, Countess Dracula reimagined her as a tragic anti-heroine, a woman so desperate to reclaim her lost youth that she turns to murder. The story blurred the line between crime and fantasy. Was she a monster, or a victim of the world's obsession with beauty? The question lingered, haunting audiences long after the credits rolled. In the decades that followed, her image evolved with every generation. Heavy metal bands sang her name. Artists like Báthory, the Swedish band named after her, used her as a symbol of rebellion against authority and morality. In video games and anime, she reappeared as a sorceress, a queen, a vampire. In fashion, designers drew on her legend, red velvet gowns, black lace, and Gothic crowns, turning horror into aesthetic. Each reinvention distanced her further from history, but each also kept her alive. The real woman was long gone. The myth, however, was immortal. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the legend took another unexpected turn. Feminist scholars began revisiting Elizabeth Báthory's story, not to excuse her crimes but to question how history itself had been written. Was she truly the monster the chronicles described? Or had her image been exaggerated by a male-dominated society eager to destroy a powerful, independent woman? These questions didn't erase the bloodstains, but they reframed them. Historians noted that noblemen of her time committed similar atrocities, executions, tortures, mass killings, often without consequence. Yet none were turned into legends of supernatural horror. Only Elizabeth was. To some, she became a symbol of how women's power is demonized, how female rage and authority are recast as madness or witchcraft. To others, she was still an irredeemable killer. But even these conflicting interpretations gave her story renewed relevance. She became a conversation, not just about cruelty, but about gender, mythmaking, and justice. Her image shifted again, no longer the vampire countess, but a mirror reflecting society's fears, of women who defy, of systems that corrupt, of histories that punish selectively. In our time, Elizabeth Báthory has become a paradox, both overexposed and misunderstood. Movies, books, and internet lore continue to retell her story, sometimes truthfully, often sensationally. Yet behind the cinematic blood and Gothic aesthetics, one truth remains unshaken: she represents the intersection of beauty and brutality, power and decay. Her legend has outlived every empire that once ruled her land. The Habsburgs are gone, the Ottomans vanished, but Báthory's name endures in digital form, hashtags, YouTube documentaries, Gothic fan art, even Halloween costumes. Each retelling adds another layer to her myth, another echo to her story. We are drawn to her not because of who she was, but because of what she symbolizes: the unending fascination with evil dressed in elegance, the discomfort of seeing horror within refinement. She is a reminder that monsters don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes, they stand in candlelight wearing jewels. Elizabeth Báthory sought immortality, at least, that's how the legend tells it. Whether she truly believed blood could preserve youth is unknown. But in a way, she succeeded. She achieved a kind of eternal life, not through sorcery, but through narrative. Every story retold, every film made, every song written in her name keeps her spirit alive. Her immortality is built not from blood, but from memory, myth, and fascination. Yet, this immortality comes with irony. The woman who may have been driven by vanity is remembered not for her beauty, but for her darkness. Her name no longer evokes admiration, but unease. Her legend, like a curse, ensures she will never truly rest. Why does the world still speak her name? Because Elizabeth Báthory represents something eternal, the warning that power without conscience always breeds cruelty, and that society, in turn, will always create monsters from those who embody its deepest fears. She is not just a story about blood and death, but about reflection, about how we, as humans, turn history into myth to understand what terrifies us. Each age reinvents her because each age finds in her a reflection of itself. In her, we see the corruption of privilege, the fear of female power, the tragedy of obsession, and the endless human desire to cheat time. Her story transcends centuries because it touches the unchanging truth of human nature, the hunger for control, and the horror that follows when it goes unchecked. As the camera pans away from the ruins of Castle Čachtice, morning light breaks over the misty hills. The stones gleam faintly, and for a moment, it's as if the past exhales. The whispers fade, but the echo remains, a name that refuses to die. Elizabeth Báthory, noblewoman, murderer, myth. She sought eternal youth. Instead, she found eternal remembrance. And perhaps that, in its own dark way, is the cruelest immortality of all. Time erases faces, kingdoms, and names, yet some stories remain, not because of what they destroy, but because of what they reveal. The story of Countess Elizabeth Báthory, for centuries old, still whispers a question that refuses to fade: how far will humanity go when power becomes its own religion? The tale of the Blood Countess is not merely about murder, cruelty, or madness. It is a mirror, a cruel and unblinking reflection of how societies allow monsters to exist, as long as those monsters wear crowns. It is about the nature of privilege, about the silence of witnesses, and about the slow corrosion of morality when people believe themselves untouchable. In her world, hierarchy was law. Nobles ruled with divine right, peasants existed to serve. Elizabeth Báthory was born into a system that worshipped bloodlines more than compassion, where wealth could wash away sin, and cruelty could masquerade as discipline. She inherited not only titles and land but also the belief that power justifies all things. And while her acts, whether as history or legend, shocked even her peers, they did not happen in isolation. They were the product of a world that had normalized domination. The peasants who disappeared into her castle did not vanish simply because of one woman's madness. They vanished because they were invisible long before she touched them. They belonged to a class without voice, protection, or value. They were born expendable, and in that realization lies the truest horror of her story. When we read about the tortures of the Blood Countess, the instinct is to recoil at her personal evil. But the deeper truth lies beyond the individual. Her brutality was not created in a vacuum. It was enabled by a structure, political, social, and legal, that believed certain lives mattered less than others. Every tyrant needs accomplices, and Elizabeth had many. Servants who carried out her orders. Clerks who falsified death records. Priests who ignored strange burials. And officials who preferred not to see what was happening within her fortress walls. Their silence was not only fear, it was calculation. To expose her crimes was to question the entire noble order. To demand justice for peasants was to defy the foundation of feudal law. So they waited, they whispered, they prayed, and they did nothing. This silence is what transforms the story from tragedy to lesson. Because silence, more than violence, allows evil to endure. The blood in her castle flowed because the voices outside its walls chose to remain quiet. The same principle echoes through centuries, from royal courts to corporate boardrooms, from palaces to parliaments. Power survives not by action alone, but by the complicity of those who know and do nothing. In that sense, Elizabeth Báthory is less a singular monster and more a symbol of systemic failure. Her story reminds us that when law serves power instead of people, justice itself becomes an accomplice to cruelty. Even today, people cling to the illusion that monsters are rare, that evil is an anomaly rather than a pattern. But Elizabeth's life tells a harder truth: evil often hides in normalcy. It wears silk, speaks politely, and quotes scripture. It hosts banquets and funds wars. The Countess's castle was not a dungeon but a palace. Its walls were hung with art. Its halls echoed with music and laughter. And yet, beneath that beauty, terror thrived. The contradiction itself is what makes her legend timeless, the reminder that aesthetics can conceal atrocity, and civility can coexist with barbarism. This duality persists in every age. The same world that condemns cruelty also glorifies dominance. We admire power even as we fear it. And in that paradox, monsters like Elizabeth find sanctuary. To understand why her story still matters, we must look at our own. The castles have changed, but the dynamics remain. The structures of authority, wealth, politics, social hierarchy, still protect those who exploit others. Today, the modern world creates new versions of untouchable elites. They may not torture in dungeons, but they exploit through systems: economic, digital, psychological. They destroy livelihoods instead of bodies, reputations instead of flesh. And like the nobles of Elizabeth's Hungary, we often allow it because power dazzles us, because authority intimidates us, and because confronting it feels impossible. Her story, stripped of its medieval costume, is still happening, in every institution where abuse is ignored for the sake of status, in every industry where the powerful exploit the weak, in every culture where victims are silenced. The Blood Countess may have lived in the 1600s, but her shadow walks among us in every unchecked hierarchy. Elizabeth Báthory's downfall teaches a paradox of justice. The same laws that protected her eventually confined her. But they did not change. Her punishment, confinement instead of trial, was not justice, but self-preservation for the ruling class. The system sacrificed her image to save itself. That is why her story endures. Because it forces us to ask, when the powerful fall, is it ever truly for justice? Or only because they became too visible, too inconvenient, too dangerous to the structure that built them? In every era, the same cycle repeats. Power accumulates, corruption festers, outrage grows, and when exposure comes, the system performs its ritual of purification. It condemns one figure as a monster, declares the rest innocent, and moves on unchanged. Elizabeth became that sacrificial monster, a vessel for collective guilt, a story that allowed her society to forget its own complicity. And yet, despite centuries of reinterpretation, her name persists. Because every retelling, every film, every debate keeps the same unease alive, the recognition that her evil was possible not because she was supernatural, but because she was human. We remember her because she represents the worst within the best, cruelty within culture, savagery within civilization. We tell her story again and again not to indulge horror, but to understand it, to remind ourselves what happens when empathy collapses and power becomes absolute. The ruins of Castle Čachtice stand as more than historical remains. They are a monument to silence, a warning carved in stone. The earth remembers what people tried to forget. Beneath those crumbling walls lie not just the bones of victims, but the echoes of a truth humanity still struggles to face, that civilization does not erase cruelty, it refines it. In the end, the Blood Countess teaches no comfort, only clarity. Her story is not an ancient anomaly but a recurring pattern, one written in palaces and prisons, in courts and corporations, wherever the strong believe they exist beyond judgment. Elizabeth Báthory's legend will endure as long as humanity itself struggles with its own shadows. For as long as we build hierarchies, we build the potential for cruelty. For as long as we idolize power, we risk worshipping monsters. And perhaps that is the real curse she left behind, not the blood of her victims, but the knowledge that power always tempts and justice always delays. The wind still howls through her ruined castle, carrying voices only history can hear. They are not just her victims. They are all of ours, reminders that silence protects no one, that truth buried beneath privilege will one day resurface. The Blood Countess is gone, but the questions she left behind remain alive. How much evil can a system excuse before it condemns itself? How long can privilege protect cruelty before it collapses under its own weight? And perhaps most hauntingly, in every age, in every civilization, how many more castles still stand, filled not with ghosts, but with the living who have learned nothing from the dead? Centuries have passed since the death of Countess Elizabeth Báthory, yet her story still lingers like a wound that refuses to close. The world has changed, empires have fallen, science has replaced superstition, and justice has new names and faces. But in the quiet spaces of human conscience, the shadow of the Blood Countess still moves. She lives not as a ghost haunting stone corridors, but as an idea, a warning about what happens when power grows unchecked and conscience falls silent. Her legacy is not confined to the ruins of Castle Čachtice. It breathes in every system where hierarchy thrives, every institution where truth bends to privilege, and every heart that mistakes authority for virtue. The myth of Elizabeth Báthory has evolved far beyond the woman herself. Over 400 years, her name has become a symbol of fascination and fear, invoked in novels, films, songs, and debates about morality, gender, and justice. But beyond the myth, her story forces us to confront a painful question: was she truly unique, or was she simply one of many whose power allowed cruelty to flourish unseen? History has buried countless names beneath hers, figures who ruled their worlds with the same coldness, shielded by the same silence. The Countess is remembered not because she was the first, but because she was exposed. Her downfall tore a hole in the fabric of her age and revealed the truth every society tries to hide, that beneath its refinement lies the potential for barbarism. The ruins of her castle still stand today, a crown of stone and sorrow atop a Carpathian hill. Travelers visit to take photographs, to whisper her name in half fear and half curiosity, to feel that chill of history brushing against their skin. The walls are cracked, the halls swallowed by moss and time, yet the air feels heavy, as if it remembers. The people who once screamed within those walls have long turned to dust, but the silence that replaced them feels alive. Some say the wind carries voices when it passes through the arches, others that the stones themselves hold memory. Whether true or not, the legend serves its purpose, a monument not to glory, but to the danger of forgetting. To look at her life is to look at a paradox. Elizabeth Báthory was both the child of power and its prisoner. She was educated, fluent in multiple languages, politically astute, a woman who could have shaped her world for the better. Yet she chose domination over compassion, indulgence over restraint. Her brilliance became her weapon, her privilege her armor. She believed, as many before and after her have, that power absolves. And when power loses its humanity, it does not need to kill to destroy, it merely needs to exist. That is why her story matters more now than ever. The faces of oppression may change, but the mechanisms remain the same: entitlement, silence, justification, and the illusion that one's actions exist beyond consequence. In a world increasingly shaped by technology, money, and influence, the lessons of the Blood Countess remain uncomfortably relevant. The castle may have turned to ruin, but its spirit thrives in new forms, in corporate towers that exploit the powerless, in governments that trade truth for control, in digital platforms that thrive on manipulation and spectacle. The difference between a dungeon and a boardroom may only be time and decorum. Both can crush without mercy when empathy is stripped away. Elizabeth's cruelty was physical, today's cruelties are often psychological, systemic, invisible. But they share the same root, the belief that some lives are worth less than others. The myth also warns us about our fascination with evil. Humanity has always been drawn to darkness, to stories of killers, conquerors, and tyrants. We consume them as entertainment, dress them in romance and tragedy, make them icons of fascination. The Blood Countess has become one of the earliest examples of how society transforms atrocity into art. Her legend was rewritten so many times that it ceased to belong to history and became part of imagination. But every retelling risks erasing the real victims, the countless nameless girls who vanished into her walls, whose suffering became fuel for stories rather than memory. We remember the monster, but rarely the lost. That imbalance says as much about us as it does about her. And yet, perhaps this remembrance, even in distorted form, serves a purpose. The myth keeps her crimes alive in public consciousness, reminding us that unchecked authority is a threat no era escapes. It invites us to question our heroes and scrutinize our systems. It forces us to ask whether the same mechanisms that shielded her, wealth, gendered privilege, noble lineage, still operate under different names. History is never as distant as it appears. The past has a way of disguising itself in new clothes and stepping quietly into the present. Standing on the hill where Castle Cactus once ruled the valley, one might wonder what remains of her story beyond ruin. The answer lies not in the stones, but in the silence between them, the silence of witnesses, the silence of victims, the silence of a world that prefers myth to truth. Each generation must decide how to break that silence. Some do it through art, others through justice, others simply by refusing to look away. The Blood Countess's greatest danger is not that she once existed, but that we continue to repeat her story in new forms without learning from it. To understand her is not to excuse her. It is to recognize how her existence was possible, and how similar conditions can exist anywhere humanity forgets empathy. The Countess's world believed in order above mercy, bloodline above fairness, wealth above worth. The modern world may flatter itself for its progress, but its hierarchies remain, more subtle, more sophisticated, but no less real. The victims may not wear rags, and the tyrants may not wear crowns, but the exchange of pain for power remains eternal. As dusk settles over her ruins, the line between past and present blurs. The wind moves through the empty corridors like a voice half remembered. The castle no longer imprisons bodies, but it still holds lessons. Every stone speaks of arrogance, of fear, of the fragility of human morality. The story of Elizabeth Báthory endures not to glorify her evil, but to warn of its repetition. She was the product of her time, and yet her time never truly ended. It merely changed its costume. So what remains of her legacy? A myth, yes. A horror story, certainly. But also a reminder, that power without accountability breeds decay, that silence is a form of complicity, and that justice delayed becomes justice denied. Her story forces us to ask whether humanity has truly evolved, or merely learned to hide its cruelty better. In the end, the Blood Countess stands as a figure not of history, but of human nature itself, the hunger for control, the ease of corruption, the blindness that follows privilege. Her castle may crumble, her name may twist into legend, but the pattern she represents continues. Every age has its Báthorys, some wearing armor, some wearing suits, some smiling from behind glass towers or digital screens. What matters is whether we recognize them before the silence becomes too deep to break. As night falls over the Carpathian hills, the ruins disappear into shadow. Only the wind remains, carrying whispers that are not of ghosts, but of memory. It reminds us that evil never dies, it only waits, for power to forget compassion, for privilege to silence truth, for fear to look away. The story of Elizabeth Báthory is not about the past. It is about the present, and the price we pay when we fail to learn. Centuries after her death, the story of Countess Elizabeth Báthory still stands like a scar carved into the conscience of history. Her name, once whispered in fear across the Carpathian valleys, has become an echo through time, a warning, a fascination, a myth that refuses to fade. But as the world evolved, the meaning of her story transformed. What was once a tale of blood and cruelty has become something larger, a reflection on how humanity constructs its monsters, and how those monsters mirror the age that creates them. Each generation rewrites her, as villain, victim, feminist symbol, or ghost, yet none can truly silence the unease she represents. The Blood Countess has become less a person and more an idea, the embodiment of unchecked power, of moral blindness dressed in nobility, of how evil becomes ordinary when wrapped in elegance. To understand her persistence, we must look not at her crimes, but at our own need to remember them. Human memory has a strange relationship with horror. We fear it, but we also preserve it, retelling it until it becomes ritual. Elizabeth Báthory's legend survives because it satisfies something primal in us, the need to confront darkness while keeping it safely at a distance. The horror she represents is both ancient and modern. In her, we see the medieval hunger for control, the aristocratic belief in divine privilege, and the eternal truth that power corrupts those who believe themselves immune to consequence. And yet, her legend also reveals something more uncomfortable, that society often needs monsters. Without them, we would have to face the truth that evil is not extraordinary, it is human. Her castle, now a ruin, still dominates the landscape of Slovakia like a warning left behind by time. The locals call it haunted, and perhaps in a sense it is. But the ghosts that linger there are not just hers or her victims, they are the echoes of every age that allowed cruelty to thrive behind walls of silence. Tourists walk its grounds with cameras and curiosity, unaware that the earth beneath their feet once soaked up the cries of the forgotten. Each broken wall and moss-covered stair is a testament to a system that valued order over mercy, power over compassion. The stones are cold, but they still speak. They say, remember what happens when people stop questioning authority. If there is redemption in her story, it lies not in Elizabeth herself, but in the lessons drawn from her fall. Her confinement, a noble punishment that spared her from true justice, reminds us that equality under law is a fragile ideal, often bent to serve those who already hold power. The king who ordered her arrest did so less for moral outrage and more for convenience. Her wealth had become a threat, her influence too large to ignore. When her crimes could no longer be hidden, her family's power protected her even in disgrace. It is a pattern history repeats endlessly, the powerful punished only when they become politically inconvenient. The real reckoning, then, is not Elizabeth's, it is ours, for allowing the same hierarchies, the same blind obedience, the same selective justice to persist. Over time, Báthory's story became detached from her reality and merged with legend. Writers romanticized her, painters turned her into art, filmmakers and musicians resurrected her as a Gothic muse. The blood became metaphor, the cruelty transformed into performance. In the process, her victims, the hundreds of young girls who died in silence, were lost again. They became invisible, just as they had been in life. Every age retold her story, but few remembered theirs. This distortion, too, holds a truth, that history often worships villains and forgets the innocent. Humanity loves to name its monsters but rarely mourns their prey. Yet despite all this distortion, one thing remains unshakable, the relevance of her warning. The systems that allowed her cruelty to thrive have not vanished, they have merely changed form. Today, exploitation hides behind bureaucracy, cruelty cloaks itself in policy, and inequality disguises itself as meritocracy. The nobles of her age have been replaced by elites of another kind, those who command wealth, influence, and technology with little accountability. The victims no longer disappear into dungeons, they vanish in data, in debt, in the margins of societies that still divide worth by status. The face of tyranny has changed, but its eyes are the same. Elizabeth Báthory may be dead, but the world that birthed her survives. In studying her, we also confront a question that transcends history: how does evil endure? The answer, perhaps, lies not in cruelty itself but in apathy, in the thousands who looked away, the officials who obeyed orders, the priests who stayed silent, the neighbors who whispered but never intervened. It was not one woman's madness that killed so many, it was the collective decision of a society to protect comfort over conscience. That same decision repeats in every era, every institution, every place where fear outweighs empathy. The Blood Countess is a story about more than one woman. It is a story about all of us. But what of the woman herself, the real Elizabeth, stripped of myth? The records describe intelligence, charisma, and an iron will. She spoke multiple languages, managed vast estates, and navigated the politics of a divided Hungary. She was a product of her time, educated in cruelty, trained in dominance, shaped by a world that measured virtue by bloodline. Perhaps that is her tragedy, that she was both villain and victim of the same system. Her evil did not spring from madness alone but from entitlement, the certainty that her class and her gender made her untouchable. In that sense, her story is not one of supernatural horror, but of human arrogance carried to its logical conclusion. As centuries passed, her image transformed. In Gothic fiction, she became the eternal seductress, the vampire queen bathing in blood to preserve her youth. In feminist reinterpretations, she became a scapegoat, destroyed by patriarchy. Both versions reveal less about her and more about us, our need to shape history into stories that fit our fears and fantasies. The truth is harder, less glamorous, a powerful woman who wielded cruelty as casually as others wielded privilege, and a society that enabled her until it no longer could. The myth may horrify us, but the truth should humble us. The ruins of her castle now stand as both tomb and mirror. They remind us that progress without compassion leads only to repetition. The path from privilege to atrocity is not ancient history, it is a cycle that renews itself whenever the powerful stop listening to the powerless. Every brick in those walls holds a fragment of that truth, every gust of wind through the corridors whispers its warning. If we listen closely, the echoes speak not only of her crimes but of our potential for them. As twilight falls over the Carpathian hills, the outline of Castle Cactus fades into shadow, and the sky burns with the last light of the setting sun, red, like memory, like warning. The wind rises, carrying voices we cannot quite hear, voices that might belong to victims or to conscience itself. The legend of Elizabeth Báthory endures because it is not about the past. It is about the fragile line between power and humanity. It is about what happens when empathy dies and arrogance takes its place. It is about the silence that turns cruelty into law. In the end, perhaps the greatest horror is not that a woman once bathed in blood, but that the world that allowed her to do so still exists in new disguises. The story of Elizabeth Báthory is the story of civilization itself, brilliant, ruthless, beautiful, and cruel. Her name may belong to history, but her lesson belongs to us. And as long as power hungers and silence obeys, her shadow will never disappear.